When Teresa Scal failed to show up for her nursing shift on October 27, 1986, her mother went to check on her and uncovered a nightmare. Teresa, a 29-year-old nurse and mother, was found brutally slain in her Lakeland, Florida home. The violent crime shocked the community and devastated Teresa's family. Yet despite an intensive investigation, the perpetrator remained unidentified. For 37 years, the question of who ended the life of Teresa went unanswered, until modern DNA technology finally revealed the truth. A newly licensed registered nurse and single mom, Teresa had an 8-year-old son who was the center of her world. She was known for her compassionate and giving nature. Those who knew her described her as warm-hearted and dedicated to caring for others. Tragically, it was in her own home that this young woman's life was violently cut short. On October 27, 1986, Teresa returned to her Lakeland duplex after finishing a night shift at the hospital. She spoke by phone with her mother, Betty, around 2:30 p.m. to ask if Betty could pick up her son from school later that day. That was the last time anyone heard from Teresa. When Teresa failed to show up for her 7 p.m. nursing shift that evening, her family grew worried. The hospital alerted her mother that Teresa hadn't arrived for work, so Betty drove to her daughter's home to check on her. By 8 or 9, the house was dark and silent, and no one answered the door. The front door was locked, so Betty used a credit card to pry it open and let herself in. Inside, she discovered a horrific scene. Teresa lay on the living room floor in a pool of blood, brutally stabbed to death. Her throat had been slashed so severely that it nearly severed her head, and the wounds on her hands and arms showed she had fought desperately against her attacker. Detectives determined that the attack was motivated by the perpetrator's desire to indecently assault Teresa. However, he wasn't able to complete the act, likely due to Teresa putting up a much more serious fight than he anticipated. Unfortunately, outside, a heavy rainstorm blew through that night, potentially washing away any footprints or other traces the perpetrator left around the house. Police canvassed the neighborhood and questioned everyone living nearby, hoping for a lead. Teresa's sisters later recalled that she had mentioned a creepy neighbor who once showed up at her door with a hastily potted flower and gave her an uneasy feeling. However, she hadn't known the man's name, so that hint never led to anything concrete at the time. Sheriff's detectives launched an investigation but quickly hit a wall. They interviewed Teresa's friends, ex-boyfriends, relatives, and neighbors, but no evidence linked anyone to the crime. One of the neighbors questioned was 33-year-old Donald Douglas, who lived directly behind Teresa's home. Douglas answered all their questions calmly and had no visible injuries from any struggle, so he wasn't considered a suspect and was quickly eliminated from contention. What nobody knew at this time was that Douglas was that creepy neighbor who had awkwardly presented a flower to Teresa. With no eyewitnesses and no weapon found, the investigators had little to go on beyond the physical evidence. Crucially, forensic technicians had collected the drops of blood that weren't Teresa's and preserved them as evidence. In the late 1980s, DNA profiling was new and not widely available, but detectives hoped that someday this blood would lead to the perpetrator. Years later, as DNA technology advanced, the sample was entered into the FBI's database of DNA profiles. No match was found. The DNA didn't match any profile in the system. That meant the person who left that blood, presumably the perp, had never been arrested and therefore wasn't in the database. Eventually, investigators accepted that barring some unforeseen breakthrough, the perpetrator would likely walk free for the remainder of his days. In 2022, decades after the trail had gone cold, investigators took a fresh approach using forensic genetic genealogy. The Polk County Sheriff's Office teamed with Othram, a private lab specializing in forensic genetic genealogy for cold cases. Othram's analysis of the unknown blood identified distant relatives of the suspect through genealogical databases. One surprising discovery in this DNA family tree was a hidden branch, an out-of-wedlock child born in the 1940s that few in the family knew about. This long-ago secret meant the suspect had distant kin in the database that wouldn't have been obvious from his immediate family. Tracing that lineage eventually led investigators to a family who had lived right behind Teresa's house in 1986. All signs pointed to one man in that family, Teresa's former neighbor, Donald Douglas. Nearly 37 years after Teresa's death, detectives finally had the evidence to name the perpetrator once and for all. They obtained a DNA sample from one of Donald Douglas's adult children and confirmed that the blood from the crime scene belonged to Douglas. The mild-mannered neighbor who had escaped suspicion in 1986 was unmasked as the perpetrator after all these years. Unfortunately, Douglas could never be brought to justice. He had died of natural causes in 2008 at the age of 54, so he was never charged. The sheriff announced that the case was solved and said Douglas likely became violently enraged when Teresa spurned his advances. In hindsight, the creepy neighbor Teresa once spoke of was indeed Donald Douglas, who had so adeptly fooled investigators by pretending to be meek and mild. Teresa's mother, now 84 years old, said she was grateful to have lived to see the perpetrator identified. Her sisters acknowledged that the discovery couldn't erase their grief, but at least they have answers and no longer have to wonder who committed this horrific act. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a quick reminder to like, subscribe, and share this video, and also hit that notification bell and turn on all notifications for my channel. Also, don't forget to check out my podcast, Lazy Chill True Crime, by clicking the links below or searching it up wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you want to appear on this beautiful shout-out page, don't forget that there's the option to support my work directly through a YouTube membership or my Patreon page. On a cold February night in 1987, a small Michigan community was shaken by a crime so brutal that it would haunt investigators for decades. 30-year-old Roxanne Wood was found slain in her own kitchen, her throat slashed. For 35 years, the question of who did this to Roxanne remained unanswered, a chilling whodunit that many feared would never be solved. The case seemed unsolvable, stalled by bygone forensic limits and dead-end leads. Yet, against all odds, a tiny fragment of DNA eventually cracked the case and unmasked the cruel perpetrator. This is the story of Roxanne Wood, the decades-long quest for justice, and the extraordinary forensic breakthrough that finally brought a killer to justice. Born and raised in Niles, Michigan, Roxanne graduated high school in the 1970s and married her high school sweetheart, Terry Wood, soon after. By 1987, Roxanne was in her early 30s, enjoying life's simple pleasures. Friends and family described her as fun-loving and generous, the kind of person who made everyone feel like her best friend. She loved tending to her rose bushes in the garden and was known for sharing homemade family recipes with neighbors. On weekends, Roxanne and Terry often spent time with friends. One of her favorite songs was Bon Jovi's Wanted Dead or Alive, a fitting anthem for a spirited woman who embraced life. And normally I wouldn't have included this last little fact, but that exact song came on my rotation about 15 minutes after reading that. February 19th, 1987, began like any other day for Roxanne and Terry Wood, but it ended in unimaginable tragedy. That evening, the couple went out for dinner and then headed to their local bowling alley for a league night with friends. Since they had driven in separate cars, Roxanne left the bowling alley alone a bit earlier than Terry, planning to head home and get some rest. Sometime after Roxanne arrived home, horror struck. In the early morning hours of February 20th, Terry walked through the door of their house, only to stumble upon a blood-chilling scene. He saw Roxanne's lifeless body was sprawled on the kitchen floor, and it was evident that she had been there for some time. He frantically called 911 and conveyed the gruesome reality of the scene to the dispatchers. When police and medics arrived, it was evident that Roxanne had been brutally attacked. Investigators later determined that she had been incidentally assaulted before her throat was cut. The crime scene offered only a handful of clues. A broken frying pan was found nearby, suggesting it might have been used to bludgeon Roxanne during a struggle. Further, an empty slot in a kitchen knife block hinted that the weapon came from her own home. Notably, as the cops secured the house, a bloody kitchen knife was later discovered stashed in the freezer. Detectives also collected a biological sample from Roxanne's body and noticed a smear of blood on the outside of the back door, possibly left by the perpetrator as he fled. There were no obvious signs of forced entry into the house, raising the eerie possibility that Roxanne may have unwittingly let the man in, or that he entered through an unlocked door. The violence visited upon Roxanne in the supposed safety of her home was shocking, and the quiet neighborhood was immediately on edge knowing a predator was at large. Or at least they would have been, if they didn't all seem to believe that Terry Wood was responsible for this brutal act of violence. In cases like this, investigators often look first at those closest to the victim, and in Roxanne's case, that was her husband, Terry Wood. From the very start, Terry fell under a cloud of extreme suspicion. He was the one who found Roxanne's body, and with no forced entry, police wondered if the crime could have been an inside job. According to reports, Terry's behavior that night added to investigators' doubts. He was said to have become agitated or belligerent with first responders. Further, when brought to the station for routine questioning, he quickly asked for a lawyer. To detectives in 1987, this seemed like potentially guilty behavior, a husband trying to shield himself behind an attorney, barely an hour after his wife's slaying. Now, before I go on any further, it's extremely obvious that the cops thought Terry was their man, and they just seemed to have stopped investigating the case after they locked in on him. I'm going to tip my hand a bit here and tell you right now that Terry had absolutely nothing to do with Roxanne's slaying. It seems likely to me that Terry understood that the cops weren't asking him friendly questions in an attempt to actually solve the crime. To them, the crime was solved. Terry did it, and they just needed to break him. Under these circumstances, it makes perfect sense why Terry would want to lawyer up right away, and may have been less cooperative than usual. Indeed, one investigator bluntly told Terry that he believed that Terry had done it. Terry adamantly maintained his innocence, and Roxanne's family stood by him. Her younger sister Janet never believed Terry was capable of such a heinous act, and insisted the real perp was still out there in the shadows. Nonetheless, with no alternate suspects and scant evidence, Terry remained the primary suspect for decades in many people's eyes. Whispers followed him everywhere he went in town, and according to some reports, both investigators and locals referred to him as Slash. It was a bitter reference to a man they had believed had slain his wife. As time went on and leads dried up, it seemed like the real predator had gotten away, and an innocent man's reputation was forever marred by the loss of his wife. Despite focusing in on Terry in 1987, police were unable to charge anyone for Roxanne's slaying. The authorities only have one opportunity to take a run at their man, and the evidence just wasn't sufficient to justify attempting to do that to Terry. Aside from the physical evidence at the scene, which in those days could only be analyzed with relatively primitive forensic methods, there were no eyewitnesses and no obvious motive. The case gradually went cold, leaving Roxanne's family in limbo. By the late 1990s, DNA profiling had emerged as a game-changing tool in criminal investigations, and evidence from Roxanne's case was tested. There was DNA from the unknown offender, but even in the 1990s, there was no match in any database, and the sample was small and degraded. In 2001, Michigan State Police took a fresh look at the case, hoping new techniques might succeed where earlier efforts failed. Unfortunately, that review also ended without a breakthrough, and Roxanne's file returned to the unsolved case shelves. By 2020, over 33 years had passed since Roxanne's slaying, and technology had advanced dramatically. Michigan State Police decided to reopen the cold case once again in 2020 in a last-ditch effort to find the attacker. The turning point in this cold case arrived when detectives turned to genetic genealogy. In 2020, investigators sent what remained of the DNA sample from Roxanne's case to Identifinders International, a California-based company specializing in forensic genealogy. This was a long shot. The sample was tiny and degraded, consisting of only a few human cells worth of DNA. In fact, it was the smallest amount of DNA ever attempted for this kind of analysis, roughly 3% of the quantity normally required to build a genetic profile based on the tech at the time. They painstakingly processed the minute DNA fragments, and against the odds, they managed to extract enough genetic information to work with. It was a groundbreaking achievement in its own right. For the first time, such a low-quantity DNA sample was successfully used to generate a genealogical lead in a criminal case. One name jumped out, Patrick Wayne Gillum, a man who, as fate would have it, lived just across the state line in South Bend, Indiana, only a few miles from Niles, Michigan. Gillham had never been on the radar back in 1987, but now he was the focus of an intense investigation. Patrick Gillham was 67 years old in 2021, living a quiet life in Indiana, but detectives digging into his past quickly found red flags. Gillham had a criminal history of attacks against women. In fact, back in 1980, he had been arrested for breaking into a woman's home in Indiana and assaulting her in a chillingly similar attack. The victim in that prior case survived the ordeal and testified against him, leading to his conviction for burglary and indecent assault. He was sentenced to 14 years in prison, but ended up serving only about 7 years before being released on parole. And yeah, this just makes me shake my head and question what's wrong with our justice system. There's people who've committed nonviolent offenses, who've served less than this guy did, for committing one of the worst crimes imaginable. Unfortunately, the next time this predator struck, he would remember a twisted lesson from this crime. Don't leave behind any witnesses. Just a few months after he regained his freedom, Gillum slipped into Michigan and police believe ended the life of Roxanne Wood. Tragically, he chose to slay Roxanne after assaulting her, to ensure she could never identify him and put him behind bars again. Armed with their new suspect, Michigan State Police needed concrete proof to secure an arrest. Genetic genealogy had pointed to this potential perpetrator, but they required a direct DNA sample from him to confirm it was his DNA at the 1987 crime scene. In May 2021, an undercover surveillance team tailed Patrick Gillum for days, waiting for an opportunity to collect something he touched or discarded. They soon noticed that he was a smoker, which presented the perfect chance. A thrown-away cigarette could contain his DNA-rich saliva. One day, investigators observed Gilham flick a cigarette butt from his truck window and seized it, but that attempt hit a snag when the lab found the DNA on it wasn't a match. Reports indicate that the cop may have picked up the wrong cigarette butt. And since I'm running on a deficit of Simpsons references lately, boy, I really hope someone got fired for that blunder. Undeterred, the team tried again. A state trooper cleverly struck up a conversation with Gillum outside a laundromat, even smoking a cigarette with him to avoid arousing suspicion. He watched closely as Gillum finished his smoke and tossed the butt aside. The moment Gillum walked away, the trooper scooped up the still warm cigarette butt with gloved hands, and this time, the evidence was airtight. Lab results confirmed a perfect DNA match between him and the unknown male DNA from Roxanne's kit, conclusively tying him to the crime scene after 34 years. With the DNA match in hand, detectives moved quickly. In July 2021, they invited the perp to a police precinct under the pretense of discussing an old case, without immediately letting on that he was the prime suspect. They showed him a photo of Roxanne Wood and asked if he knew her. Gillum casually claimed he did not and soon grew uneasy, eventually saying, "I gotta talk to my lawyer." The cops bided their time a little longer to firm up the case, and on February 17th, 2022, almost exactly 35 years after Roxanne's slaying, police finally arrested Patrick Gillum. Confronted with the DNA evidence, he reportedly professed confusion, at one point telling investigators that he had no idea how his biological material could have got there. Wrong answer, Patrick. Wrong answer. However, in March 2022, rather than go through a lengthy trial, Gillum agreed to a plea deal. He pleaded no contest to second-degree slaying, which meant he did not admit guilt in words, but accepted the punishment as if he were guilty. In practical terms, a no-contest plea leads to a conviction and sentence just like a guilty plea, without the defendant explicitly saying he committed the crime. By taking this deal, he likely avoided a potential life sentence, while the prosecution reduced the risk of an adverse finding at trial. After all, the prosecution is required to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt, and one hiccup on cross-examination could have resulted in this guilty man walking free. At his sentencing on April 25, 2022, Patrick Gilham, then 67 years old, was ordered to serve 23 to 50 years in prison for the slaying of Roxanne Wood. Under this sentence, he will not be eligible for release until he serves at least 23 years behind bars, at which point he would be around 90 years old. In all probability, the prison cell will be where he spends the rest of his life. Unfortunately, if he had received a proper punishment for his first major crime, Roxanne would have still been alive. In court, the tearful convict offered a brief apology and said he was quote-unquote sorry and praying for forgiveness, but his words rang empty to Roxanne's family. One of Roxanne's brothers coldly remarked that it's common for people like Gilham to, quote, find Jesus only after they've been caught. He questioned why he didn't voluntarily come forward when he had the chance if he was truly so remorseful about this horrific act. The obvious answer, of course, is that he wasn't remorseful for the act, but rather the fact that he got caught yet again for committing the same sort of sick offense. Roxanne's case, once deemed unsolvable, became a landmark example of modern forensic science triumphing over time. It showed how persistence, innovative genetics technology, and old-fashioned detective work could unite to solve even the coldest of cases. Roxanne Wood's story is tragic, but it now stands as a testament that justice delayed didn't necessarily have to mean justice denied. It also sent a strong message to people out there who committed heinous offenses in the 1980s or even earlier. It's only a matter of time before you're rotting in a cell.